I've already talked about the tax inequity, but in order for us to talk about what money goes out and where we should be spending, where we should be cutting money, we really have to understand the difference between different types of budgeting that the federal government uses. And we also need to understand the terminology that they use. So I'm going to try and simplify it down so that you understand or can kind of be able to follow along in the future. And certainly we'll be able to follow along in the next few videos where we talk about what our government spends money on and how much money they have coming in and the deficit and those things, right? So first and foremost, whenever you hear the word budget, budgetary, or spending, know they are talking about the exact same thing. It is the word that comes before that that makes the difference. There are three types of budgeting in the federal budget. There is mandatory budget, there is the discretionary budget, and then there is the supplemental budget. We're going to talk about all three. But know that if I say mandatory budget, mandatory budgeting, mandatory spending, those are basically all the same thing coming out of the same bucket. So the mandatory budget is basically those long-term planning things, those things that we're not going to be able to pay for 100% upfront by taking all the money out of the American taxpayers and paying it in one fell swoop. It is also stuff that we won't be able to take delivery on in one fell swoop. So if you're planning on buying a house, you may have a separate savings account just to pay for your down payment when you go to buy a house. That is your mandatory budget. You're putting that away long-term for a long-term goal. You are using it only for that long-term goal, and you can use it for nothing else. Now, you or I, in a bind, might pull out of that mandatory budgeted savings account, but in federal law, it is supposed to be illegal for them to do that. They cannot say that this money is mandatory budgeted for A and then pull from it for B. The only way they can do that, we'll get into that a little later, but that money in that A savings account has to go back. That money can only be used for that particular thing. Again, mandatory spending is long-term. So a great example that would affect you or I would be what we spend on the interstate. Interstate money that comes from the federal government is long-term budgeted. It is mandatory budgeting. The repairs to it are under mandatory budgeting. And up until the last administration finally passed an infrastructure bill, we had not seen an infrastructure bill to cover those kinds of long-term costs and repairs in a long time, in almost 2 decades. No joke. They had dragged it out to the point that our roads were in severe disrepair. Bridges. That is what typical mandatory spending means. Now, the next one is discretionary budgets. Discretionary budgeting is that annual minutia that you and I get to hear about all the time. Now, the discretionary budgeting is that budgeting that basically is on an annual basis, right? This is the stuff the president, his team, her team, goes ahead and comes up with how all of this spending and where all of this spending is going to go. And then that is approved by Congress. And it's not really so much a law because the president doesn't sign it. The president actually comes up with an entire plan for this discretionary budget and gives it to Congress, and then Congress approves it. And then that's the discretionary budget that we use for the next year. So discretionary spending then is paychecks for the military, for federal employees, to help homeless people in the United States of America. It's also the money that pays for Veterans Administration doctors and nurses and personnel. Pays for our postal workers. The reason I want you to understand that right now, because later when we talk about Doge, it's going to be really important. But discretionary monies basically are fluctuating year to year. And there is a lot of leeway with those particular monies on how they're spent from president to president. No long-term planning. It's a year-to-year thing. Supplementary budget is where there's been an emergency. Either something has been not used or overused in the mandatory budget and more money needs to go to it, or more money or less money needs to be used out of the discretionary budget. More often it is about the discretionary budget, but it does often happen with the mandatory budget. Now, all of that money is called supplemental budgeting. And those arguments take place periodically whenever the government has overspent or underspent money that it was supposed to be spending. Seems all pretty simple at that point, right? Supplementary budget will magically disappear at the end of every federal government fiscal year and start all over again, because supplementary budget for this year will roll into what is called the discretionary budget for the final tally. Did that make sense? So when all is said and done, we only have mandatory and discretionary budgeting, and all supplemental budgeting is for that year while it's active, supplemental budget. But in the next year, it rolls into this discretionary budget tally. So when the final numbers come out, there is no supplemental budget discussed. It is only within the discretionary budget. I hope this video makes a lot of sense. Ask questions below if you need to. Be respectful. I do not tolerate nonsense. Always welcome to answer your questions, even in videos. I will figure it out for you. I will figure out a way to explain it to you simply. We will discuss more about the mandatory budget in the next video. As always, think about it. Peace.